Thank you very much, Kazumi. We are very glad now to welcome Mr. Brent Wanner. He's the head of the power sector unit at the International Energy Agency. He has been contributing to 14 editions of the World Energy Outlook, and including as a lead author of the recent Future of Geothermal Energy report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginie. Merci. Bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you today. While those are bringing up, so I'll present a bit of the highlights and some of the findings from the recent Future of Geothermal Energy report that we published in December 2024. So very recent, which I think all of you or many of you are aware of. I should also say I'm here representing a big team that worked on the report. I was a co-lead of the report with our renewable division lead analyst there, Hemi Bahar. And also in the room we have 3 colleagues who also worked very closely on the report, Courtney, Francois, and Martina. So please, I know they've also been with you yesterday, so please, the discussion is not just with me. But today, I think this will work well. To give you a view, maybe I will stand here if I'm not in the way. This is our recent report. So to say I've been at the IEA for 14 years, the World Energy Outlook is my sort of day-to-day job, but I've worked on many technology roadmaps and analysis over the years, as well as country-level studies. So this was an iteration where I should say the motivation very much came out of timing. Our executive director was hearing and being asked more about geothermal. What are some of these advances he was hearing about in oil and gas? How does it affect the opportunities for geothermal? And he felt the timing was right for us to raise geothermal up the overall energy agenda. We are, as the agency, of course, the TCPs, there are technology collaboration programs across many technologies. The World Energy Outlook and our overall work is keeping an eye on how these technologies are then changing the overall energy picture. And so when there are advances and when there are movement, which you all, I'm sure, know better than I do on geothermal, this was a good time to bring up to policymakers, and we're trying to bring it up to policymakers more and more. I think to jump to one of the conclusions is that, unfortunately, it's not on the agenda in many countries. It's not in their view or top of mind. And so part of the reason for the report is also to bring it higher up their own agendas. I think if the clicker, okay. So the place to start, I think, is that the report itself covers both traditional, conventional hydrothermal geothermal energy, as well as next generation geothermal. But the first is to look at where we are today, which I'm sure you know well, but about 80% of geothermal energy is used for heat, which is on the left side, a little over 20% for electricity, but it provides only less than 1% of global energy demand. And it's very uneven of how important geothermal is by country. China uses the most, but it's a very small share of the overall energy there. And so usually these are the top sort of 10 countries that people have in mind of where geothermal is largest, where the resources are. And I think I'll keep coming back to that point, but there's a sense that there are these hotspots for geothermal, quite literally, but then that's it. And I think that is really the cornerstone of the report, is that it's about reopening those opportunities and taking a second look at what geothermal can do. When we look forward, taking from our announced pledges scenario in the previous year in the World Energy Outlook, we see strong growth. This is for electricity, but similarly for heat. We see growth coming. We see several times over in the years ahead as countries look to fulfill pledges and plans. But geothermal, conventional geothermal, remains a small part of the overall global energy system, so less than 1% of global electricity, even if it grows 5 times, which is our assessment looking at country by country. But that's where the conventional side, the hydrothermal side, ends, and where we're talking more and more about, and I think everyone here knows well, new next generation technologies from enhanced geothermal systems, which include some form of fracturing, to closed loop geothermal. And both of these not represented well on this figure, but are much deeper. And this is obviously the point of the workshop. Deep geothermal, generally conventional hydrothermal has been 1,000 meters, maybe up to 2,000 meters at the deepest levels, where next generation would be below that or deeper than that, 2,000 meters down to potentially 6,000, 7,000 meters. And I think that's really the key. We are already seeing real world projects of both types of enhanced geothermal and closed loop, or sometimes called advanced geothermal. That language also we understood in the going through the report was not fully settled, but we collectively call them next generation geothermal. And really deep geothermal is another way to think of it. So we also worked externally with a partner, Project Innerspace in the US, to map the resource potential, particularly if we go to different depths. And I think this is also to say our scope is global. And the purpose here, this is what we normally think of. You can hardly see the yellow hotspots here for the energy potential if you go to 2,000 meters. So where we're, again, the countries we're used to thinking of, Iceland, Indonesia, parts of Africa, parts of the US, Japan, but the resources are very site-specific. And even, we have also here in Europe, Italy, of course, was the first to deploy commercial geothermal. But if you go deeper, if you go to 4,000 meters, and this is a temperature plateau of 150 degrees Celsius, so this is to produce electricity. I should point out here, if you have a lower temperature threshold, then of course there are more resources, which relates to heat. At 4,000 meters, it starts to be much more significant potential around the world. And if you go to 7,000 meters, it's virtually everywhere. And this is really the game-changing kind of view between that 4,000 and 7,000 meters, where it suddenly becomes a question of cost, not of resource potential. And I can say since the report, I've had a few discussions with policymakers, and several have said, we looked at geothermal decades past, and they had this picture in mind, that we don't have the resources here. We would love to, but we just don't have the resources. And so our messaging is very much look here and look here. You do have the resources, and it will become about cost. And that's for producing electricity, and for heat, the opportunities are even easier. So I think this is really key and something we're saying whenever we have the chance, and Dr. Roll is also communicating this to policymakers whenever he can. If you think in terms of overall potential then, if you go down to these depths, one thing to say is that previously, conventional geothermal, if you map the overall potential here for electricity generation, solar PV we know is widespread and huge. Onshore wind, offshore wind, also enormous. These are many times over what the globe uses, what the world uses in terms of electricity. Previously, hydrothermal, geothermal energy would be here under the line. You wouldn't hardly see it on this kind of potential map. But with deep geothermal, it suddenly becomes actually the second largest potential source of low emissions energy in the world. And you can see we've broken it down by depths there. So it could produce many times over the amount of energy the world uses across all fronts. Another key area of the report, and one place that certainly I can say Courtney was a big part of here, was thinking of what's changing this? Why have we opened up, or why are we looking deeper? A lot has to do with the improvements that have happened in the oil and gas drilling industry. The oil and gas industry on drilling techniques, where they're able to go deeper, faster for less, and also the fracturing techniques have improved. And so a lot of the report we focus on this overlap of oil and gas expertise with geothermal. Here showing in terms of the overall cost, the overall investment cost, what portion overlaps with the oil and gas industry skills. So if it's highlighted in blue, different shades of blue is different areas. That's all overlapping with things that the oil and gas industry already does and where they have expertise. So conventional geothermal, over 60% of the activity and costs overlap with oil and gas skills and expertise. But for enhanced and closed loop systems, it's much higher. So it's 80 to 90% of those costs are directly related to activities that the oil and gas industry undertakes regularly. So it offers then a bigger chance for this transfer of skills and to help drive down the costs of deep geothermal, which was a part of the report is looking at, okay, we have technology advances that's opening up the potential, but again, what will it cost? And what are those opportunities? So looking at where the projects are today and some of those recent projects, which are more or less first of a kind. We have, commercial projects scale in Germany, closed loop systems in the US. And the costs are something like $15,000 per kilowatt, which is quite high. If we think in dollars per megawatt hour terms, that's something like $300 per megawatt hour, 250. So there's very clear we need to bring down the costs. That's normal. New technologies, we need to drive those down. So we looked at what are the opportunities then to bring that down with this transfer of skills from oil and gas. If we only have a low level of transfer, so if they're kind of developed separately, we saw that the opportunities there would be more limited. Whereas if we can really harness all of the oil and gas expertise in different areas, including on research, as well as economies of scale, those costs we see can come down quite significantly to $3,000 a kilowatt or so, just in the next 10 years to 2035. And this is also in line with some of the ambitions at the company level and project level. So what would that mean is that in terms of a levelized cost of electricity on the left here, you would go from something close to $250 a megawatt hour down to $50 a megawatt hour if you had that full transfer, which would mirror the kind of cost reductions we've seen for solar PV in the last decade. And this would make it one of the cheapest sources of low emissions electricity and energy that we've ever had. And as I said, this would be a widespread resource and potentially very inexpensive, which would unlock, we see if we follow that kind of cost curve, which again, steps need to be taken to do that, we need to see new projects, we need to see really strong engagement from the oil and gas industry. It would unlock the kind of market potential we see on the right here, where by 2035, we're looking at something like over 100 gigawatts of projects completed with market opportunities around the world. And by 2050, going to something like over 800 gigawatts, which would mean that this is would meet about 15% of global electricity demand growth over that period, putting it behind only solar and wind. And we think these are not the most ambitious views on any of this, on the costs, on the market potential. As a dispatchable low emission source of electricity, we see huge opportunities in many markets around the world. And the same for heat. And I know that is a big focus here of the opportunities here, but we mapped, again, looking market by market. We look at the opportunities for industry, here showing for district heating. And I think the key thing to point out is it's not concentrated in one region. We see huge amounts of heat could be provided if we're able to drive down those costs. If we have less cost reductions, those opportunities would remain smaller, naturally. And in terms of heating, it could capture 20% of the growth. So this could be one of the most important sources for the long term to decarbonize, to reduce emissions, a local source, a reliable source, and a sustainable source. And to put then that all back together, which I think for one question we always get is sort of what will it take in terms of investment, or what are the market opportunities in terms of capital? That scale of deployment for electricity and heat and an industry, if you put them all together, you'd be talking about $1 trillion of cumulative investment by 2035. Obviously, that's a lot of capital to mobilize. $2 trillion by 2040. But this is the kind of scale that we'd be talking about, which, depending who you're asking, this can be a scary thing, but I can say most of the time the response to this from big companies is more interest because they're looking for big market opportunities. And this can certainly, we think deep geothermal can be among those. So some of the recommendations from the report, and that's my final slide, is I won't run through all of them very closely, but I think these are drawing on the expertise and the input also from this group and from reviewers of where we see some of the challenges. We heard we talked with developers, we talked with also utilities, we have this ongoing engagement. One thing to highlight is we see very few specific policies for geothermal. When you look globally, more than 100 countries would have them for wind and solar, very clear targets, long-term plans, but 30 or less for geothermal. And so it's very much not yet fully on the radar for policymakers around the world. I think in Europe, it's ahead, and particularly Europe and heat is further ahead, but that's unfortunately not the case everywhere. And so I think that's also something for this group to keep in mind, that expanding that visibility is really important, and something that we're trying to do with the report and happy to continue. Making sure the environmental standards are there. If we're going to have this kind of growth, we're going to have challenges on skills. We're going to need to make sure that permitting is very streamlined, that local authorities are ready for this and planning for this. We also see on the investment side, a lot of the question is where the revenues will ultimately be. Will there be certainty on that? And making sure that there are recognizing all the value that geothermal as a dispatchable source, whether it's electricity or heat, that brings. And ultimately working together to bring the learnings from one place to another where we have real projects, knowing also here in Europe, here in Paris even, those experiences I think are really invaluable to other countries and other locations to realize this is a real technology and it's here and it can be done. And ultimately that as it gains momentum, to keep building on the momentum. So I will stop there on the previous report, and just to say that we will continue in the World Energy Outlook and the International Energy Agency headquarters work to bring geothermal up in every discussion that we can. But I think it's also worth noting that we are reflecting what the policymakers have on their agendas. So we can, let's say, volunteer it to be on the agendas, and we will continue that. But ultimately, it needs to be on their agendas to then kind of reflect back. So I think it's a task for all of us to keep it there, to move it up in terms of the visibility for them, and ultimately be incorporated and be a significant part of plans going forward. Thanks very much. And
time for some questions. So, is there any in the room? Yeah, I see. If you just can introduce yourself and a name and company.
Damien Bonte, I'm from the BRGM. I got a quick question. I had a lot of questions, but I'm going to stick to one. The question I have is, how did you account the workforce to actually ramp up that much? Because that's a huge increase in 10 years, and will be a requirement for more geoscientists, driller, name it, at every single level, that from operational to R&D, and that's already on the agenda of most, in terms of there is a lack of geoscientists, and they're closing some geoscientists in some universities, some geoscience departments. I'm not going to name the Netherlands, but I will. There's been a thing recently. No, it's a shame, but so how do you account workforce, and how does that fit, and will that be a big problem for developing that far? If there is investment but nobody to do it, then we're...
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think a key words to clarify first is we see this as market potential, and we raise there. So this is not a forecast or prediction of it's more of what could be. And again, if we get everything in line, so among that is workforce. So we highlighted in the report that this would take a huge scaling up of the people involved in geothermal energy. Now, in some way, there's good news of this. We also look compared to what's happening in the oil and gas industry, what kind of skills, and obviously with the transfer of skills, there is a big workforce there that could possibly transfer across into geothermal. Courtney, I'm going to say something that maybe I'll get wrong, but the process also for retraining and reskilling, those professionals can move over to the geothermal industry relatively quickly within a year, if I remember correctly, something like this. Yeah. Yeah. exactly. So I think this point is really clear, and I think that's also one that we had very much in mind of as we move forward with decarbonization plans and potentially the activities in oil and gas, how those are changing if they are also in a, let's say, a more forward-looking, climate ambitious kind of scenario. Those activities may be coming down, and so there may be workforce available to transfer and looking to transfer. So it can also be a synergy if you think of this transfer of skills. That's not going to be necessarily tomorrow, but I think that's it's definitely a key concern, and one that we think in terms of technology deployment. It's not just of investment decision and then it happens. But these supply chains are really important, including labor. Yeah, good question. Thanks. See another question.
Good morning. I'm Miklo Šantić. I'm Managing Director of GPCIP. I'm also the President of EJEC. I would like just to add more a comment than let's say, commenting your figures. Last week we were with the board of EJEC meeting the Vice Deputy Director General of the DG Energy, and then we were asked. I just make a quick number. You know, in Europe we are 440 million people today, or 470, something like that. Statistics varies. And then 75% of this population is living in urban area. And 75% of these people living in urban area are eligible to geothermal district heating. So we roughly are speaking of 250 million people. To achieve this, we'll need to drill 14,000 doublets. That means 28,000 wells. In the world, in a year, there are 118,000 wells drilled. So how do we transfer all these people from busy in drilling 118,000 wells to our 28,000 wells? And this is going to be for the, let's say, next 10 years or 2040. This is the big question, related also to the human sources. And then another comment is that only for geothermal, bearing in mind that we are dealing with larger hole diameters. So we are drilling, we are having bigger wells than the oil and gas wells. Only the steel factories in Europe are not equipped to supply the steel casing in due time. So we have resources, human resources, and then I'm not tackling the regulation and all that, the other aspects, but Philippe will come and speak to you later. Okay, this is it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, that is also why we look so far forward here, because obviously the years are indicative of if we start now and take this seriously, and if policymakers start building up those supply chains, I mean, for example, 2030, there's very little that can be done by then. But if we got serious about this in 10 years, we see that we could have significant workforce, significant training going forward, and start building up those supply chains to then start scaling up. Of course, if we wait, or if this is slower to develop, maybe we still have this kind of trend, but maybe it starts later. So I think this is also to get in mind that this is not, turning on a switch for policymakers, that we need to have a rigorous plan that is longer term to build up that development, and it won't just happen overnight.
Thank you.